Rose Henderson stared at Alex Trebek and whispered 4 words that would destroy everything. "You're Alex Trebek," she said, loud enough for the entire book club to hear. In that moment, America's most famous game show host realized his carefully hidden secret was over. The 6 elderly women who'd become his only real friends were about to discover he'd been lying to them for months. But how did America's most famous game show host end up hiding his identity in a suburban living room, pretending to be nobody special? The story began on October 15th. Alex Trebek was driving aimlessly through Pasadena after another brutal chemotherapy session when he spotted a handwritten sign, "Thursday Evening Book Club, new members always welcome." The handwriting was shaky, clearly written by someone elderly, and posted on a crooked piece of cardboard. Something desperate inside him knocked on that door. The cancer treatments had left him feeling invisible, forgotten. Here was a chance to be someone else. The silver-haired woman who answered, Mildred Patterson, looked at him with curious brown eyes behind thick glasses. She was small, maybe 5 feet tall, wearing a flowered apron over a blue dress. "You're interested in joining our little group?" she asked warmly. "I'm Alex," he'd said quickly, his famous voice automatically dropping to something softer. Just Alex, not Alex Trebek, not the man whose face had been on television for 37 years. "Well, hello, Alex. Come in, we're just starting tonight's discussion." That first Thursday evening changed everything. He met the other members in Mildred's cozy living room, with its floral wallpaper and family photos covering every surface. Dorothy Walsh, the 80-year-old former English teacher, sat straight in her chair with perfect posture, gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. She had sharp blue eyes that missed nothing, and a habit of tapping her pen when someone used poor grammar. Helen Martinez, 68, was plump and cheerful, with silver hair curled weekly at the beauty shop. She always wore colorful cardigans and brought homemade pies wrapped in dish towels. Her hands were permanently stained from years of baking, and she spoke with a slight southern accent left over from her Alabama childhood. Rose Henderson, 70, was the quietest of the group, a widow who'd buried her husband of 50 years just 2 years earlier. She had gentle gray eyes and always sat in the same chair by the window, usually knitting while they talked. Her voice was soft, but when she spoke, everyone listened because she always had something thoughtful to say. Margaret O'Brien, 75, was the group's mother, Hen. Her Irish accent grew thicker when she was excited or upset. She'd worked as an emergency room nurse for 30 years before retiring, and she still had that no-nonsense way of speaking that came from dealing with life-and-death situations. She wore practical shoes and always brought tissues in case someone got emotional during their discussions. Betty Chen, 62, was the youngest member and the most energetic. She worked part-time at the local garden center and always had dirt under her fingernails, which she'd apologize for constantly. Her black hair was streaked with silver, and she had laugh lines around her dark eyes. She was the one who suggested new books and kept their reading list organized. But Alex hadn't counted on one thing that would make his deception both perfect and dangerous. These women were smart, really smart. Dorothy had taught high school English for 40 years at Pasadena High, and could spot a student's lie from across a classroom. She'd dealt with teenagers trying every excuse in the book and had developed an almost supernatural ability to detect dishonesty. Rose had raised 6 children, 5 boys and 1 girl, and buried 2 husbands. She'd learned to read people's faces like maps, seeing the worry lines and hidden pain that others missed. Margaret had worked in busy emergency rooms where reading people quickly could mean the difference between life and death. She knew fear when she saw it, could spot someone hiding something important. These were exactly the kind of women who should have seen through anyone trying to fool them, except they trusted him completely. For 12 weeks, from October through December, Alex Trebek sat in that circle of chairs every Thursday at 7 o'clock and lived the biggest lie of his life. The meetings followed the same comfortable pattern each week. Mildred would serve coffee in her good china cups, Helen would bring whatever she'd baked that day, and they'd spend 2 hours talking about books like they were old friends, sharing secrets. Week after week, as they discussed everything from Fitzgerald to Steinbeck, these brilliant women accepted him as Alex, the thoughtful retiree who loves literature. When Dorothy gave him reading assignments with the same stern voice she'd used on thousands of students, he followed them faithfully. When Helen saved him the biggest slice of pie and worried that he was too thin, he was genuinely grateful. When Rose quietly brought herbal tea on evenings when he looked particularly tired from his treatments, he was moved nearly to tears. When Margaret fussed over whether he was eating enough and started bringing containers of homemade soup, he He felt cared for in a way that had nothing to do with his fame. When Betty shared stories about her garden and offered to teach him to grow tomatoes, he was touched by her genuine kindness. They were loving a man who didn't actually exist. The routine became sacred to him. Every Thursday at 7 p.m. sharp, Alex would park his car 3 blocks away and walk to Mildred's house. He'd changed his appearance slightly, different glasses, a baseball cap, clothes from department stores instead of custom tailors. Nothing dramatic, just enough to look like any other retiree. Mildred always had the coffee ready in her good china. Helen always had dessert, usually something that reminded Alex of his childhood. Dorothy always had passionate opinions about whatever they were reading. Rose always listened more than she spoke. Margaret always worried about everyone's health. Betty always had stories about difficult customers at the garden center. For 2 hours every Thursday, Alex Trebek disappeared, and just Alex existed. A man who loved books, who had thoughtful opinions, who could cry over a beautiful passage or laugh at a witty observation. Not a celebrity, not a patient, just a reader. But slowly, inevitably, the cracks were starting to show. 3 weeks ago, during their heated debate about The Great Gatsby, Alex had completely forgotten himself. They'd been discussing Daisy Buchanan's character, with Dorothy arguing that she was simply shallow, and Helen insisting she was a victim of her time. The conversation had grown passionate, with everyone contributing different perspectives. "The green light represents the corruption of the American dream," Alex had said with conviction, his distinctive voice unconsciously slipping into that measured, thoughtful rhythm that millions of viewers knew by heart. Gatsby isn't reaching for love, he's reaching for an illusion that was never real to begin with. The whole novel is about how the promise of America has become a dangerous mirage. Dorothy had paused mid-argument, tilting her gray head to one side like a curious bird. "You know, Alex," she'd said slowly, her sharp teacher's eyes studying his face with new and uncomfortable intensity, "you sound exactly like someone who's interviewed literary experts and historians, like you've had professional conversations with people who really understand these deeper themes." Alex's heart had nearly stopped beating. He'd forced what he hoped was a casual laugh, deliberately changed his voice to something more ordinary, and quickly steered the conversation toward Helen's excellent apple pie. But those penetrating blue eyes had stayed on him for the rest of the evening, and he'd noticed Dorothy watching him more carefully during the following weeks. 2 weeks ago, during their emotionally charged discussion of Toni Morrison's Beloved, Alex had made another critical mistake. They'd been talking about trauma and memory, with Margaret sharing her experiences as a nurse who'd seen people deal with terrible injuries. The conversation had grown deep, personal, powerful. "Morrison shows how trauma literally lives in the body," Alex had said, unconsciously slipping into his professional interviewing voice, the tone he'd used with psychiatrists and historians. "The way she writes about Seth's scars and phantom pain demonstrates how physical and emotional wounds become permanently intertwined. It's not just powerful literary metaphor, it's established psychological truth that modern neuroscience has proven." Margaret had looked up sharply from her complicated knitting pattern, her experienced nurse's eyes studying his face intently. "Alex, dear," she'd said with careful precision, "you talk like someone who's spent considerable professional time with trauma specialists and researchers. That's not the kind of deep knowledge you pick up from casual reading." Warning bells had been ringing loudly in Alex's head. Too much specialized expertise, too much professional insight, too many references to conversations with experts that a simple retired book lover would never have had. They were starting to connect dots he'd tried so hard to keep separate. Now, this Thursday evening in January, with gentle rain tapping against Mildred's windows and the warm, comforting scent of Helen's apple cinnamon pie filling the cozy living room, everything was finally about to collapse. They'd been having what started as their usual thoughtful discussion about Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, when Rose Henderson, who usually sat quietly knitting, had started watching Alex with those knowing, intelligent eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. For 20 long, increasingly uncomfortable minutes, she'd studied his face while he enthusiastically debated questions of moral courage with Dorothy, thoughtfully agreed with Helen about the complexity of Atticus Finch's character, and passionately shared Margaret's righteous anger about the persistence of racism in society. The conversation had been going well. Alex had been careful to keep his insights at a reasonable level, to sound like an educated reader, rather than someone with professional expertise. But then Betty had asked an innocent question about the book's continued relevance in today's complicated world, and Alex had made the one fatal, irreversible mistake that would destroy everything. What is justice in an unjust world? He'd responded without thinking, the question rolling off his tongue in that perfect practiced rhythm he'd used for 37 years to introduce Jeopardy categories. The distinctive cadence that said, "This is your host, Alex Trebek." Rose's eyes had gone wide with shock and recognition. Her delicate coffee cup had rattled against its saucer, and a few drops of coffee spilled onto Mildred's antique lace tablecloth. Alex watched in growing horror as Rose's face changed, as recognition bloomed across her weathered features like a flower opening in fast motion. The other women were still talking, Dorothy making a point about literature's role in social change, Helen worrying about what children were learning in schools today, but Rose's world had suddenly narrowed to focus entirely on the man sitting directly across from her, the man whose voice she'd heard 5 nights a week for decades as she prepared dinner for her late husband, the man who'd asked what is 10,000 times in that exact rhythm and tone, the man who definitely was not Alex the quiet retiree at all. "Oh my God," Rose whispered, so quietly that only Alex could hear her devastating words. But even whispers carried significant weight in this close-knit group of sharp-eared women. Conversations began to slow and falter. Heads turned with curiosity toward Rose, then toward Alex, sensing that something important was happening. Alex felt the crushing weight of 37 years of carefully constructed public persona crashing down around him like a house of cards in a windstorm. These wonderful women who'd given him the gift of genuine, uncomplicated friendship were about to discover that he'd been lying to them from the very first moment he'd walked through Mildred's front door. But what happened next would somehow be even worse than simple discovery. Rose's mouth was opening again, and Alex knew with absolute certainty that the moment of truth had finally, inevitably arrived. "You're Alex Trebek," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent room for everyone to hear. The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. 6 pairs of eyes turned to stare at him in complete shock and disbelief. Dorothy's mouth fell open mid-sentence, her pen dropping from her fingers. Helen's hands flew to her chest in surprise. Margaret's knitting needles went completely still. Betty went pale as paper, her dark eyes wide. And Mildred, sweet trusting Mildred, who'd welcomed a complete stranger into her home with such warm hospitality, looked like she'd been physically struck. "Is that true?" Dorothy asked, her experienced teacher's voice cutting through the heavy silence like a knife. "Are you really Alex Trebek?" Alex met her eyes, saw the hurt and confusion beginning to form there, and knew that his precious sanctuary was about to become his place of judgment. "Yes," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I am." The explosion that followed wasn't anger. It was something far more devastating. It was betrayal, deep and personal and cutting. These 6 women who'd opened their hearts and homes to him, who'd shared their thoughts and feelings and friendship with him for 3 precious months, suddenly realized they'd been unknowingly performing for a celebrity who'd been studying them like interesting specimens in a laboratory. 3 months, Mildred said, her voice shaking with hurt and disbelief. 3 months you've been sitting right here in my living room, Alex, letting us welcome you into our lives, letting me serve you tea and cookies, letting us all share our stories with you. She paused, unable to finish the devastating thought. Margaret's Irish accent grew thicker with emotion, as it always did when she was upset. "We welcomed you with open arms. We did. We cared about you, worried about your health when you looked tired, saved you the best of everything we had to offer. And here you've been laughing at us behind our backs this whole time, haven't you?" "I wasn't laughing at you," Alex started desperately, but Dorothy's sharp teacher voice cut him off before he could continue. "Don't you dare," she said, her blue eyes flashing with hurt and anger. "Just don't. We trusted you completely, Alex. We opened our hearts to you, and you deliberately made us into fools. You made us feel foolish for caring about someone who was just playing a role with us." The raw pain in their voices was infinitely worse than any professional criticism, any harsh review, any negative judgment he'd ever received in his long career. These remarkable women had seen something genuinely worth caring about in him, and he'd repaid their precious trust with calculated deception and lies. Helen was crying quietly into her flowered handkerchief, her gentle shoulders shaking. "I saved you the very best pieces of every single pie I baked," she said through her tears. "I worried when you seemed tired. I truly thought we were becoming real friends." "We are friends," Alex said with growing desperation, reaching toward her. "That's exactly why I—" "No," Rose interrupted, her usually gentle voice now sharp with anger and betrayal. "Real friends don't lie about fundamental things. Friends don't pretend to be completely different people. Friends don't make us feel stupid for caring about them. Betty stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. I need to leave right now, she said, her voice tight with emotion as she grabbed her purse. I need to process this somewhere else. The other women began gathering their things too, and Alex realized with growing horror that his worst nightmare was coming true. Not just discovery of his lies, complete abandonment by the people who'd become most important to him. Please, he said, standing up and reaching toward them with obvious desperation. Please give me just one chance to explain this properly. Explain exactly what? Mildred asked, her usual librarian's composure finally cracking. Explain how you decided we were safe enough to practice being normal with. Explain how you tested our friendship by lying about who you are. The words hit him because they contained just enough truth to be devastating. I was terrified, Alex said, the words torn from deep inside his chest. I've been famous for so long I honestly don't know how to tell anymore if people like me for myself or just for my celebrity status. When I found all of you, when I saw how you welcomed me simply for loving books, I was absolutely terrified that if you knew who I really was, everything would change forever. So you decided for us? Dorothy demanded with fierce authority. You decided we couldn't handle the truth? I decided I couldn't handle losing this sanctuary, Alex replied, his voice breaking. I decided I'd rather have 3 months of real friendship than spend the rest of my life wondering if people care about me or just my fame. The room went quiet again. Something in his desperate honesty had shifted the energy. Mildred sat back down slowly. Real friendship, she repeated thoughtfully. But how could it be real when we didn't know who you actually are? But you did know me, Alex said fiercely. Everything I shared, every thought about the books, every opinion, every reaction, that was completely me, the real me. Not Alex Trebek, the TV host, just Alex who loves literature. Rose was watching him again, this time with calculation. The man who cried over beloved. That was real. Every bit of it was real, Alex confirmed. The only fake thing was my last name. Margaret had stopped gathering her things. And when you looked tired some evenings, Alex hesitated, then decided these women deserved complete truth. I'm fighting pancreatic cancer. The treatments make me exhausted. Coming here was the only time I felt like myself, instead of a patient or celebrity managing illness. The admission hung in the air like smoke. Helen sat back down slowly. Cancer, stage 2. This book club became my lifeline, the one place where I could just be a man who loves reading. Dorothy studied his face with her teacher's intensity. How long? 6 months since diagnosis. 3 months since I found you. Mildred looked around at the other women. Ladies, I think we need to discuss this. Alex, would you mind waiting in the kitchen? He waited 25 minutes, listening to their voices rise and fall in heated discussion. When Mildred called him back, their faces were unreadable. We've voted, Mildred announced. This is our decision. Alex braced himself for banishment. You're staying, Dorothy said simply. But there are conditions. Alex's legs nearly gave out with relief. Anything. No more lies, Margaret said firmly. Ever. No special treatment requests, Helen added. And no testing us again, Rose said. If you don't trust us enough to be honest, then don't be here. Betty, who'd returned during their discussions, spoke last. And you have to tell us about your cancer. We're not your fans, we're your friends. Friends worry about each other. Alex nodded, tears streaming. Thank you for giving me a second chance I don't deserve. Everyone deserves friends who'll love them through their mistakes, Mildred said softly. Even famous people who should know better. What followed was the most honest conversation Alex Trebek had ever had. He told them about celebrity loneliness, about never knowing if relationships were real, about the fear that had driven him to deception. They told him about feeling invisible as older women, about their own struggles with trust and authenticity. By evening's end, something had been broken and rebuilt stronger. Not just friendship, but understanding. As he prepared to leave, Dorothy caught his arm. Alex, next week we're reading The Catcher in the Rye. I expect your real thoughts, not what you think we want to hear. Alex smiled, feeling lighter than he had in months. What is authenticity without the willingness to risk everything? Dorothy smiled back warmly. That sounds like the Alex we want to know. Have you ever been so afraid of rejection that you chose deception over honesty? What would you do if friendship required risking everything real about yourself? Share your thoughts below, like this video, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. Thank you for watching.